So, welcome to the webinar. The webinar today features Debbie Kasper from Hiram College. The topic, Beyond the Knowledge Crisis, that is the title of Debbie Kasper's new book. There is widespread agreement that radical and immediate social changes are necessary to avert catastrophic collapse of Earth systems and allow for the possibility of sustaining healthy human civilizations. Among other challenges, achieving this level of transformation requires an unprecedented degree of social learning. Many argue that higher education could, and some say should, play a central role in facilitating this learning. Despite decades of earnest and well-intentioned efforts, however, higher education, even sustainability-oriented higher ed, has not yet risen to the challenge. A deeper transformation of education itself is needed if we are to create the kind of transformation education our circumstances demand. Drawing on insights from her new book, Beyond the Knowledge Crisis, Debbie Kasper today in this webinar looks at some of the deeper reasons for this apparent failing. In attending to the roots of the problem, she argues, we gain insights into some practical actions we can take now in the classroom and in our curricula to help create the conditions for effecting the more radical changes called for. Debbie Kasper is a sociologist and associate professor of environmental studies at Hiram College in Northeast Ohio. Her teaching and scholarship reflect a commitment to integrating knowledge, establishing common ground, and demonstrating the practical value of big ideas. Among her eclectic course offerings are Intro to Socio-Environmental Studies, Human Settlements, Permaculture Basics, and Systems Thinking and Social Change. Her new book, Beyond the Knowledge Crisis, a synthesis framework for socio-environmental studies and guide to social change, was published this year by Palgrave Macmillan. What I'm going to do now is shift the presenter role over to Debbie Kasper. And Debbie, the floor is yours. We'll look for you. There are your slides. Again, everyone, please mute your lines and turn off your cameras so we can pay full attention to Debbie's presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ira. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Ira, let me know. Okay, you were coming in a little bit garbled for me, and I don't know if it was my connection or something else. So I just want to make sure that, that you can hear me. So thank you so much for this invitation, Ira, and for all of your work with the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium. Had I known that a tote bag was on the line, I would have paid closer attention, but darn it, I missed that opportunity. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to express my appreciation for the diverse work of so many on this front. I've learned and continue to learn so much from all of those who work in this space. So I want to thank you for your dedication and hard work and for being here. This is the first time I have been on this side of the go-to webinar. I've attended some of the SCC webinars, but this is a new experience being on the other side of it. So it's also the first time I'm talking about this book. So really happy to be here. My fondest desire is that what I bring here, that is just a small part of a bigger whole, can complement and support all of those efforts in some useful ways. So I'm going to turn my camera off now because in some testing earlier today, we were having a little bit of difficulty. And so we think it might be better if I just turn my camera off. Okay, and let me just orient myself to some of the controls here. Okay. All right, so I want to begin by giving you some context for what I'm going to be talking about today, and then we'll get into it. Ira invited me to offer a webinar, I think, after receiving a notice about the book that he just mentioned. And the reason I feel the need to give some context here is because at first glance, my book may seem like a bit of an odd duck among publications relevant to sustainability. For one thing, I'm a sociologist, and even stranger than that, I'm a theorist. And then there's the fact that this book was published as part of a series dedicated to highlighting the work of a little-known German sociologist named Norbert Elias. With those credentials, I can imagine that sustainability is not exactly the first thing that comes to mind, but I hope to persuade you that the ideas I've been weaving together actually represent some crucial and necessary ingredients for developing the kind of education for sustainable human and environmental systems that we need. As for me, I'm a bit of an odd duck too. I'm a big picture systems thinking kind of person, but at the same time, I'm also super practical. I like to attribute this to my Midwestern working class upbringing. And I say that because, you know, in the academic world, when there appears to be a problem that needs solving, if I think I can help, for better or worse, I usually jump in to try. And in my professional life, this has manifest as a kind of tension between my home discipline of sociology, which I've always sensed has the potential to offer so much clarity about so many complex issues, but which has not yet fully realized that potential. And over years of thinking and study, especially with two key influences, the insights of Norbert Elias and my work in the realm of environmental sociology, I began to see more clearly what was in the way of meaningful advancements in social science and what could be done about it. So in various ways and places, I began to argue that environmental sociology, which was introduced in the 70s as a way to situate the study of social phenomena in the world, was not really a subspecialty of sociology, but actually represented a foundation of it. So all of this was fermenting for a while, and in time, I joined an environmental studies department. And through my work there, the relationship between my work and sustainability started to become more explicit. I became more active in different academic communities and started following other conversations more closely. And the refrain I began to hear incessantly, really nearly every day, was basically this: we know a lot, but in order to effectively use what we know to address urgent, complex problems that confront us, we need a way to integrate that diverse knowledge from across the disciplines and especially across the natural and social sciences. This sentiment showed up in online discussions, reports, academic papers, and books, both current and going back decades. And I remember thinking at some point, surely someone has addressed this by now. But the more I looked for answers, the more confirmation I got that no, actually, this problem is very much alive, and attempts to solve it to date have not done the trick. Meanwhile, something else started showing up. In response to conclusions that massive and immediate transformations in our social systems are necessary to avert the worst of potential social and environmental consequences, researchers looked to the social sciences for guidance on how to make the needed social changes. Finding little help, they added a theory of social change to the list of demands. So now everywhere I looked, I saw calls for, one, a means for integrating relevant knowledge, and two, a reliable theory of social change. Gradually, it dawned on me that what I had been proposing as a general unifying theory in sociology also functions as an integrative theoretical framework for socio-environmental studies and a theory of social change. And so I began pulling it all together into what eventually became this book. And so here we are. What you're seeing here is the table of contents. And if anyone's interested, I think you can read the intro and the conclusion for free at this website that's listed here. But I just want to say a little bit about it to give you a sense of the scope of the book. So it begins by examining what many call the crisis of knowledge, the fragmentation that results from excessive specialization. Discovering that this concern actually goes back centuries, I then explored efforts towards synthesis, which I found out also go back that far. And I look at how all of this played out in the development of the social sciences, what went wrong, how we can use what we've learned to reimagine the social sciences, and very importantly, why we need to. Then I zoom out to get a much needed map of the socio-environmental territory in which humans no longer have to be sort of like shoved artificially into, but in which we naturally and comfortably fit. And from here, we can see a basic pattern of socio-environmental processes. So from there, it delves into each of the major components of that pattern. The biophysical conditions, which are the medium of our lives, the patterns of relations within which we as individuals develop and acquire layers of social learning, which make up our second nature, the nature of the impacts of human activities, and how this pattern generates ongoing change, the understanding of which can be used to more intentionally guide change in the ways desired, at least in principle. Okay, so with all of that as a preface, we're ready to get down to business. So here's what we'll cover today. There are three main points. I'm going to start with an overview of how higher ed is doing relative to the demands of the day. And spoiler alert, most people say it's far from where it needs to be. Then we'll look at some of the reasons for that and what we can do about it, both in our classrooms and our curricula. Okay, so starting with the overview. As I'm sure everyone here is aware, the times seem to be calling for radical change. To avert the worst possible outcomes, analysts of many different stripes say we need a rapid transformation of our social systems, how we meet our needs, how we make decisions, evaluate success, and so much more. And these general conclusions derive from obviously a whole bunch of different research, but I'll just hit some of the highlights here. One of them is what we know about the fact that we are surpassing or have surpassed certain planetary boundaries, boundaries that are said to be sort of the safe operating space for human civilization. So we've already crossed 4 of these, and researchers are paying careful attention to those and others. We know a good bit about projected climate scenarios based on carbon emissions, different carbon emissions pathways, and what it looks like if we do certain things versus other things. And there are a lot of folks who have translated all of this into what does this look like for life in the world? What does this look like for our societies and our experience of that? I like this version from the Great Transition Initiative, which shows us 6 different scenarios along these 3 main pathways. Of course, we don't know exactly how things are going to turn out, but either way, it's argued, our societies and our lives will be different. So whether we use what chances remain to make enough change to matter fast enough, or we just end up dealing with the fallout of crises as they unfold, they say change is coming, ready or not. And most people agree that it's far preferable to be proactive in making those changes. in selecting how we will preempt certain outcomes or respond to circumstances, create the kinds of systems that we need and want, rather than being just left to react to whatever comes next. So higher ed is one of the obvious and important means for equipping citizens with the knowledge, skills, and the mindset for doing this work. Of course, there are many different views of what higher ed is for, but as institutions set up, at least in principle, to systematically disseminate information, to keep a society's basic knowledge up to date, and to support the development of critical and clear thinking, schools are an obvious entry point for change. In fact, this actually aligns really well with what schools have long said they're about. What distinguishes the carefully crafted mission statements of institutions of higher ed from other organizations is precisely their orientation toward change and the future. Devoted to generating and disseminating knowledge and skills, their central value proposition is service to society and the long-term greater good through education. And while subtle differences in focus have been noted between the missions of public and private institutions, they both exhibit a significant emphasis on civic duty and service and preparing students for the world of tomorrow. I happen to teach at a liberal arts college, and at places like this, it's even more pronounced. So in spite of pressures to shift the focus on jobs, the mission statements of liberal arts colleges reflect an overall commitment to future-oriented changes that serve the greater good. So the table you're looking at here is a result of some work I did with a student and a colleague for a paper which has not yet been completed, but this table shows the frequency with which certain themes indicated by the most frequently appearing key terms show up in college mission and vision statements. For comparison's sake, we include some of the most common generic terms that show up in mission statements, like excellence and knowledge and professional. And what we found was that the terms reflecting an emphasis on having an impact in the wider world beyond oneself, and individual change and growth, and service appear in mission statements with greater frequency than all but two of the most commonly appearing generic words. And when we add the vision statements into the mix, the themes of action, interdisciplinarity, and future also top the list. So we can see that the alignment between sustainability goals and stated institutional intentions is there. I see that as a lot of good potential. Yet, as many observe, higher education is not playing the role it could or perhaps should to prepare students for life in the real future. So here's just a little snippet from an essay by a professor of sustainability education, Stephen Sterling. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this group, but the Great Transition Initiative out of the TELUS Institute, they circulate an essay on a theme at the beginning of each month, and then they invite people to respond. And at the end of the month, the author takes into account all of the essays that have been submitted, they rewrite the piece, and then it gets published. And so there's a really nice collection of these you can check out. But this one elicited more than 50 response essays in the month of March. And they were from powerful voices in education around the nation and the world. And although they all had different opinions about what the problems were and what should be done, the one thing they had in common is that none of them thinks that higher ed is even close to providing the kind of education we need. Over the years, of course, there have been more targeted efforts, so not just talking about higher education in general, but in specific ways, there have been really strong efforts. And so in the 60s and 70s, for example, awareness of environmental problems sparked the emergence of environmental studies and sciences programs. Later, recognition of the human, global, and intergenerational dimensions of these problems led to growth of sustainability programs. And they both sought to do those two things, to equip students with, one, integrated knowledge for real world problem solving, and two, to help shape a more positive future. But these efforts too have been deemed somewhat unsuccessful, or at least undeveloped. Studies have found environmental studies and sciences programs to be theoretically ungrounded, some say, or a hodgepodge, an incoherent smorgasbord that doesn't help students understand how change works and therefore to effect change, leading some to conclude that they are selling their students and the planet short. And sustainability, as guests on this webinar have pointed out, continues to be somewhat of a special interest in higher ed, tends to concern infrastructure more than education, and remains poorly understood. Now, I want to pause here to emphasize that I don't think this is the fault of those teaching in these areas. As someone who teaches in these areas, it can be hard to hear this stuff, but I also appreciate these observations. You know, the fact is that the relevant disciplines aren't sufficiently integrated. There is fragmentation. We do lack a coherent theory of social change. And so if that's the reality, we can't very well materialize integration in theory on the spot. I want to stop to recognize that there's been so much good work done. And yet at the same time, that we still seem to be far from where we need to be. So I want to help by pointing our attention to why this is the case. How can this be? Those are the second part of the talk. The answer, of course, as Stephen Sterling points out, is it's not simple. There are powerful economic and political and cultural forces at work, I would say both at large and small scales, even in institutions themselves. And certainly these are important to consider, but I want to direct our focus to some of the deeper reasons. So, used in systems thinking, the metaphor of the iceberg offers insights into why our efforts haven't worked as well as they could. It depicts varying levels of visibility and depth, and very importantly, of leverage. At the top, we have the most visible stuff, the events that spark reaction. And if we look at how sustainability tends to be pursued in colleges and universities, we notice a lot of activity at this level. We do a lot of reacting to events. So over the past 50 years, whether the issue has been pollution, war, climate, inequality, there are certain conventional reactions. Don't know enough? Add more content. Don't know the right things? Add some new requirements. Discover the limitations of individual disciplines? Institute some interdisciplinary classes and programs. And again, I want to say these can all be good things to do, and I've done them, and we do them here. But from a systems perspective, they're limited in the sense that if we're not addressing the real causes of the problems, then none of those reactions can have the intended effect. So the real causes of the problems go much deeper. And again, you know, in higher ed, we can only do so much. It's not like we can fix everything. But what I want to suggest is that an educational setting can at least help future citizens learn to see and understand some of the real causes at work. So probably in many cases, we get to the level of examining historical trends and patterns. I think increasingly, we're beginning to pay attention to the structures of relationships at work, and that's good. What I'm particularly interested in are the mental models, the paradigms, the unstated assumptions, beliefs, values, and mental pictures which shape how we see things and which can be keeping us stuck. So more than just that, I also am trying to understand our own role in that. How am I perhaps perpetuating this problem? So the idea here is that if we are to create the kind of transformative education that our circumstances and reality demand, we need a deeper transformation of education itself. In particular, I'm suggesting that we deploy higher education in ways that ultimately can help address this deepest level, how we think and how we see ourselves in the world with others, the frames that shape this view. So this is what I'm talking about when I use the word radical. From the Latin radicalis and radix, meaning of or pertaining to the root, to get radical, as I put it here, means to get to the root of the problems. That's where we need to go. And we do that when we begin to see and address problems at those deeper levels. When we're no longer just rearranging parts, but engaging in real transformation. Now, I feel like I need to add a note here to say I'm not totally naive about the challenges of transforming higher ed or education at any level for that matter. I mean, honestly, there are a lot of things working against us in many ways. And yet, here we are in a legitimate position to shape how people think in particular ways. The need is there. That's certainly not a new observation. You don't have to look far to find calls for a paradigm shift about any number of things. Here are some examples I've spotted in recent reading. But more often than not, this call for a paradigm shift is also a call to move from one thing to another, specialization to integration, seeing ourselves as apart from nature, being a part of it, from independence to interdependence, to think in terms of dynamic processes, and to move from our concern with immediate near-term needs to seeing the big picture in the long term. So the demand is there, the role is there, the opportunities are there, and I think we have nothing to do but try. When it comes to changing paradigms, you might find yourself saying, as I often have, we don't have time for that. That's too slow, or that's too abstract. We need action. Or how are we supposed to make it happen? These are all fair points. We do need action, and we need it now. But I would add that among the kinds of action meaningfully responding to our current crises entails, rethinking how we think is one that deserves far more attention than it usually gets, especially in schools and in the classroom. This is usually the place where books and articles and presentations end, but I think it's where we need to start, because actions not informed by a clear view not only won't get the job done, they might be misguided or unsustainable, but they may even make matters worse. So while paradigms may seem too amorphous to address or too slow moving to spend time on, I think the level of paradigm is one of the most powerful places to intervene. As Donella Meadows puts it in her book, a leverage point that totally transforms systems. And I would add, rethinking how we think in redesigning our systems are mutually supportive and reinforcing. Bad mental models, on the other hand, stand in the way of our getting to know reality and ultimately of designing viable systems that work with it rather than against it. So I want to offer an example and to use a subject I really love, which might be surprising. It's part of my eclectic nature, and that is about soil. So under the paradigm that still prevails in how most people think about soil, well, for those who think about it at all, which maybe is not that many people, they see its makeup and productive capacity as a matter of nutrients in the soil. So stuff in various proportions, like NPK, for example. And this way of thinking determines what they do, determines what they measure, they look for, how they attempt to solve problems. In this case, for instance, by adding those nutrients in the form of inorganic fertilizer. And all of this affects what the impacts of their activities are. So while they might get an initial boost of productivity, it quickly wanes as soluble materials, most of which the plants can't take up, are washed out with the rains and enter waterways, leaving behind salts and compaction, making matters worse and locking us into a cycle of tilling, soil loss, water pollution, expensive chemicals, and despite all that, declining productivity. On the other hand, looking at soil in a completely different way, as the paradigm shifting microbiologist Elaine Ingham does, we see that we've been going about it all wrong. Not the nutrients themselves we need to focus on. Those are present in the soil already, but it's the biology, the living microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, and all that good stuff, and the relationships among them and with the plants that make those nutrients available to plants in the right proportions every minute of every day as they eat, excrete, and are eaten. And all of this is done with very little inputs from us, and at the same time, increases productivity. So when you think about soil in this way, you approach it differently, and you get a very different outcome. This is one picture from one of Elaine Ingham's case studies, of which she has many. But similarly, I think, when educational institutions perpetuate bad mental models, problematic paradigms, either actively or passively, they can end up blocking rather than advancing their own goals. In some ways, obstructing efforts toward the kinds of changes we need. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like we are swimming in a sea of cognitive dissonance. So despite knowing that problems are complex and interrelated and require integrated knowledge, specialization proceeds apace. Sometimes it seems there's a major disconnect between what we know about the state of environmental and social systems that healthy human societies depend on and the priorities that drive our investments and actions. We claim to be preparing students to flourish in the future, yet we perpetuate ideas that the future will be just like the past, with ongoing growth and progress. We speak of global citizenship and community, while in some ways exacerbating an already extreme individualism. And this is all the more disturbing because we sincerely want to do better. Most of us, I think it's safe to say, work really hard to create and maintain classes and programs and initiatives and other changes intended to help. And again, I want to emphasize that this is so good. This is really good. But when we operate in the conventional way, so just paying attention to those events at the surface level, reacting without addressing the deeper roots of the problems we're trying to address, institutions of higher education and even well-intentioned teachers like me can end up perpetuating those problems. Okay, so the good news is, of course, we can do better. We can do so much more. And one of the places we can start, I suggest here in the third and final segment of my talk, is in our classes and programs. And ultimately, if we're able to get really radical at institutional levels too, I'm going to share just three things from the book that can be translated into practical action for paradigm change in classrooms and curricula. Okay, so first, a more accurate mental picture of an integrated reality. One of the most important places to start is in how we convey the relationship between humans and the environment. I think oftentimes, even when we're trying to be helpful, we unwittingly reinforce the idea of them as side by side, which reinforces the sense of separation even while we're trying to link them. The language and the visuals we use can do this. And so rather than strengthening that inaccurate picture of these realms as separate and in need of arrows to somehow connect them, one of the ways I've been playing with this is to help students see the interrelated yet distinct levels of phenomena that are always taking place. That is, life is made of and emerges from physical phenomena, and social phenomena is and emerges from the biological and physical. It's so simple, but can be a really powerful way to remind us that human social life is made of, emerges from, takes place in, and necessarily has impacts for biophysical conditions. Now, I'm no graphic designer, so this isn't a very beautiful graphic, but I hope it conveys the basic idea. And maybe someday I will meet somebody who can make this prettier. But we can do this in a number of ways. There are so many ways that we can help our students see themselves and their societies as part of the world, not in opposition to it. We can do this consistently, conveying this idea, reminding and reinforcing. So the image that you're seeing right now is little snippets from one of my syllabi. I use these basic categories to structure my class, the intro class in our environmental studies program. I use it to organize the readings that I assign. This screenshot is from an online textbook I've used in the past, which allows us to rename chapters and reorganize them. And so I use these headings to rename things so that these themes are consistent throughout the class. And then throughout the weeks of our course, periodically, I'll remind students where we are, give them a little orientation about, where we've been, where we are, how those connect. And in all of these ways, I keep reminding them of these three levels. And it seems to be really helpful for them. So, so this is something that's really easy to do in the classroom, in our classes. But if we want to think a little bit bigger for a moment, we can also imagine doing this in our institutions overall. So this might be a little too radical for some, but I noticed that, when you look at college and university websites and college catalogs, they organize their majors in a number of ways, but typically when we talk about them or we try to categorize them, we kind of put them into buckets, which again, it's practical, can be helpful in some situations, but it reinforces this impression that these realms exist kind of arbitrarily side by side. Students get this message from day one, and it keeps getting continually reinforced. And I would suggest that, even in fields like my own, environmental studies, that want to highlight interdisciplinarity, and they do it in a lot of really colorful and artistic ways, but it ends up being somewhat arbitrary and unclear what those relationships actually are. And so, when we want to emphasize the importance of interdisciplinarity, it can be difficult to explain that because we don't have a really good way to actually show students what those relationships are. So the mental picture of those levels of phenomena that I shared just a moment ago gives us a way to see real relationships between areas of study. And this is just something I played around with the majors at my own college, seeing if I could place them in these areas. And I write about this towards the end of the book. And I think the nice thing about this, it not only shows how these areas fit together, for those which are interdisciplinary, it makes it a little bit more clear what that actually means and what they span. So those are just some thoughts about that. But I think we further reinforce these mental models with the language we use, which brings us to the second item, alternative concepts. I think in order to help our students, and frankly ourselves, think in terms of dynamic interdependence, we really need to equip them with language that can handle relationality, process, non-duality, rather than reinforcing assumptions of separation, basis, and either or kind of dualism. So this image shows the basic pattern of socio-environmental processes that I discuss in the book, and applying some of those alternative concepts there, we can see what I think are some more helpful terms. Only two of these terms are unfamiliar, kind of strange to most. They each get a full chapter in the book, but I think some of the ways that we can use language like this and try to embed it into the way we work is to, for example, rename classes when it's appropriate. So we've recently renamed our introductory course. It used to be called Humans in the Environment, which sort of reinforced the idea we were trying to overcome in the class. And it's now called Introduction to Socio-Environmental Studies. We've adjusted our language. So when we speak about problems and impacts, we talk about them as socio-environmental problems and impacts for the most part. And it's really working. Our students are talking differently and they're thinking differently. And I'm really seeing this come out in the seniors right now. I'm supervising in their capstones. So we're very encouraged, just these small little changes. We are considering renaming our program to better convey all of that. Maybe something along the lines of socio-environmental studies, but that's a much bigger discussion we need to have with our Office of Admission. But when we put all of this together, it's the third and final point I'll mention, which the book goes into in depth, this integrated framework and general theory of social change, which I know sounds just ridiculously huge. But the thing of it is, when we assemble a more realistic picture of socio-environmental processes with more adequate language for thinking and speaking about them, we end up with an integrative framework for socio-environmental studies, and one that actually serves as a theory of social change. So this framework, just really briefly, I'll just say a few things about it. It helps students to see the processes that are simultaneously at work. So pictured here at a very high level of synthesis is an undefined moment of time where several things are happening simultaneously, albeit at different levels and rates. So it's all taking place within biophysical conditions. Unique individuals develop a socially shared habitus within those conditions and the patterns of relations that they develop within. And the collective expression of that happens through their activities, which impacts other people in the world in ways that will shape the subsequent conditions and subsequent moments that all of this takes place in. So when we see these moments in a series, we see this basic pattern unfolding over time. And this not only helps us see how different processes fit together, and it offers guidance for exploring and explaining and anticipating social change, which is what the last chapter of the book is all about. It also can help us see how the subject matter and the disciplines that study it relate. So we go from something like this to this image on the right, which is just a really quick and generic attempt to place disciplines on this framework where they would most often be found. It's not a hard and fast rule by any stretch, but we could move them around depending upon the problem that someone is studying. But the point is, it gives us a way to see where things fit together, where different research questions and findings fit together, which is really helpful. So if any of this piques your curiosity and you want an easy way to explore it a little bit further, I want to let you know you can read these 3 blog posts on Medium. I forced myself to write them. I'm a little bit shy, and so I'm not a huge promoter of my work, but I committed myself to seeing if I could translate some of these key ideas into short, pithy ways that would be helpful, especially for teachers. So they're there. I did it. And if you're interested, you can check those out. Of course, if you want a deeper dive into any of these ideas, you can see the book, which was written really intentionally to be accessible. That is, to not read like sociological theory typically does. And I think it can be helpful for educators who are trying to rethink how they approach their work. And in my experience, in assigning select chapters to students, I think it can be really helpful for students as well. So to begin to conclude here, I just want to say the radical hope, perhaps against all odds, but I have it nonetheless, is that by using the many opportunities higher education affords to implement, cultivate new mental models, using the powerful leverage of paradigms, we can begin to grow the roots for a few things that we really, really need. So one is seeing ourselves and our situation more clearly, recognizing and perhaps even embracing the limits we're subject to, and for accepting and stepping into our role as co-creators of this unfolding future that we're all shaping. And I know paradigm shift is not sexy or flashy. It's not fast. Although on an individual level, it can happen in the blink of an eye. I know it won't be easy. Of course, there are vested interests who won't go quietly, but I do think it's time to explicitly engage in this work, to cultivate worldviews and matrices of meaning that are more congruent with reality. I think higher education institutions are in a position to take the lead on this. I know there's so much more work to do, but if healthy human civilizations are to have a fighting chance, I think this is one kind of action that we need to take. So with that, I will close and thank you for your attention.
Debbie, thank you very, very much. That was a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. How is my sound quality at this point?
It sounds good. I'm just trying to figure out how to unshare my screen.
Okay, I just want to be sure that before I continue babbling on that people can hear me. So I
Sounds
want
good
to
to me.
especially thank you for drawing everyone's attention to some interesting writings that many of us were likely unaware of. Not just the Stephen Sterling piece, but some of the Susan Clark, and I'm never quite sure how to pronounce Michael Manigate's last name, but hopefully I didn't.
Oh, I always say maniates. I hope that's right.
Well, that's what I was saying, and then someone told me it was wrong, but who knows?
Oh, okay.
So anyway, but other than the writings, I have to compliment you on the great slides. I particularly like the nematode slide and your examples in the closing segment, and your effort at the social, biological, and physical cake without a professional graphic artist. So yeah, good, very,
Thank
very, very,
you.
very nice. So we are getting some comments and questions in the chat box, although we welcome more. Those of you who are familiar with our webinars know that we do not end at the top of the hour. We're scheduled through 15 after the hour and often go a bit longer until the conversation ends. So let me first draw your attention, Debbie, to one note in the chat box from Rebecca Watts Hull. And to get to the meat of it, she talks about her background as a sociologist and agree completely about well, there's the part that I was looking for, that teaching about enacting social change is inherently threatening to many people and organizations, including those with close ties to higher education. And she goes on to say, in her view, it's important to include discussion of power whenever we approach questions about social change, including different forms of power and how to build power. And I thought you might want to react to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. You know, a couple of things come to mind. One is that I think one of the points I want to make, and I talk about this in the book, is that when it comes to change, I think, of course, just on a human level, that can be threatening. You know, we have this sort of innate resistance to it, but it's really important if we're what's the name of my blog? Oh, getting to know reality. If we're thinking about how reality really works, then we have to confront the fact that change is always happening. So it's going to be happening. We have some particular circumstances right now that are telling us it's probably going to happen in these certain ways. We might want to intervene to shift the direction of that. So there's some really good reasons to be motivated to confronting the reality of change and really getting involved in that conversation. And absolutely, power is inherent in that process. And so I think when we, particularly in sociology, when we make that shift from thinking of societies as things, these entities, to really looking at them as dynamic patterns of relationships within which power is inherent throughout, as a sort of ratio. Elias talks about this as a power ratio. That when we can start to see that and really pay attention to it, it becomes much easier to recognize how that can play into change efforts and possible outcomes. And we can just have a much more um, calm and cool-headed approach to the overall subject.
Thanks, Debbie. Before I move on to another point in the chat box, especially for those who have not been paying attention to the chat box, I want to note that if you're like me and can't wait to get your hands on Debbie's book, Debbie did arrange with her publisher to get us a discount code. So I did include that in the SCC announcement for this webinar, the announcement that came from us. I didn't want to run afoul of other listserv posting rules, so it was only on our announcement, but it's now also for those of you who learned about this webinar from other sources. The code, the link to the code is in the chat box. Let me move quickly then to one of the points that Matt Polsky raised. Matt is one of our regulars, and he made a point about the role of educators, and said he's less and less sure that service and idea generator roles of higher education are still active, as among other things, I see them struggle with identity and cancellation issues, not at all providing the guidance or model society badly needs. I thought you might react to that as well.
Yeah, I mentioned at one point that, maybe I don't want to say the deck is stacked against us, but there's a lot going on right now in higher ed, and there's a lot that it's pulling our attention and our energy in different directions, and yeah, it's certainly understandable to get the impression that it would be very difficult to move the needle in some of these other ways. But at the same time, I think that some of the things going on are more interconnected than we might realize. And, without taking on all of those causes or all of the movements that are taking place in higher ed right now, I think there is really some room for at least pushing the needle in a productive way, especially if we're doing it collectively and consistently. And in some ways, I think helping ourselves and our students just see more clearly how social change happens, how reality is working. In some ways, I think it can actually kind of mitigate some of those larger cultural trends that we see affecting higher ed so much right now. I don't know, there's a lot to think about there, and I find myself kind of on this roller coaster of getting really hopeful and excited, and then just getting really overwhelmed by how much is happening in the higher ed space right now. But, I still have to come to work every day and do this work. And so as long as I'm doing it, I want to make sure I have ways to do it in such a way that I think is productive and fruitful, and maybe helps others do that as well. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but it's a big question.
Yes, a lot to unpack there, and we can spend a lot more time talking about that, and we probably will. But let's move on now to another point. In another one of his posts, Matt Polsky posted a link to a piece about transformations, and you use the transformative terminology, as many of us are familiar in the sustainability space, that helps to define the space. While we're talking about defining sustainability, I also should pick up on Linda Urban's comment, I would say that by definition, anyone who's interested in sustainability believes that paradigm shift is sexy. So thank you, Linda, for that comment. But back to transformations. Having spent the last couple of years myself deeply immersed in looking at socio-ecologic systems, adaptation, resilience, transition studies, and transformation, to say the least, it's a contested space. There are a lot of competing definitions out there in that bundle that I just listed, and you used most of those terms in your presentation. And that leads me to this question. Maybe not necessarily as advice for the rest of us, we can all make our own decisions, but when you're deciding how to teach this stuff and you see month by month, year by year, the continuing discourse on all of these topics, and it really is difficult. It's a big challenge to try to make sense of all of it. And what your presentation included, your best shot at making sense of all of that. But how do you keep track of what is coming out, what is emerging from academia? Because again, because it's so interdisciplinary, it is a struggle to pick up on insights from different disciplines. So why don't we try to begin to wrap up on that point, and maybe it reduces to the challenges of interdisciplinarity. But if you do have some specifics to offer, Debbie, that would be great.
I think you're asking how can one keep up with and make sense of this of scholarship and everything coming out of the space, because there's just so much. Is that right?
Right. From a teacher's perspective, from how you presented in the classroom, do you just wait until the next summer vacation and say, I'll see what came out over the past year and what's interesting? Or are there things that you do keep up with in real time?
Yeah. What an interesting question. Lately, because the semester's been so crazy, I've really been feeling like there's too much to keep up with. I think when I was writing, I was sort of painstakingly, keeping up with all the listservs and conversations. And so I kind of go back and forth. I don't go out of my way to catch absolutely everything, because a lot of the themes I have found just keep repeating themselves. And but I try to stay abreast of what's going on. So I think on one level, my brain is always kind of buzzing with all of this activity, and there's all these people and new people coming into the mix and new things being said, and it's really interesting. And then when I think about, okay, what do my students need? I have to kind of take it down, and I think about it as striking a balance between keeping things simple and keeping in the forefront of my mind, where are they coming from? What do they need to understand at this point? And what do they need to have as a foundation to build on going forward? And so that kind of brings me down a little bit to a practical level of something I can do in class. But at the same time, one of the things that I think really informs my teaching is I also want them to know about this bigger conversation, because I feel, and I don't know if other sociologists feel this way, but I feel like I sort of discovered certain problems in my discipline by accident, and no one ever said, okay, well, here are the things we're struggling with, here are the things we didn't get right. And I want to save other people from having to sort of discover it all on their own. So in the environmental studies sustainability space, what that means is I try to give them a sense that this is a live conversation. This is, contested space. Here are some arguments. The jury's out on some things, but I try to do that in a very general way so that they know that what we're talking about has a context. It's not a done deal. It's not like, just textbook, here's the information. But I don't give them too much because they don't need it. So just keeping that balance between giving them what they need in a digestible way while also introducing them to the complexities of it. It's kind of a fine line that I'm always trying to walk.
Well, thank you for that, Debbie. I think those still listening will find that useful. I've just posted in the chat box 2 items that even over the past week or so, I have found very useful in sorting out the overall lay of the land in sustainability, or if you want to frame it as sustainability management or sustainability science. People are of different minds on that terminology as well. But the annual review article by Clark and Harley was quite good in laying out the breadth and depth of the field, and is a useful roadmap for faculty, I believe, to get a handle on things. The other one, a paper by Carl Folk and a cast of many, called Our Future in the Anthropocene Biosphere, is a very similar type of paper that takes, the broad view and helps to identify the different nooks and crannies within sustainability that I found very helpful from a faculty perspective. So I have the names and titles in the chat box, but not the links. They should be pretty easy to find with Google search. So
thank you so much, Ira. And I want to thank, I'm just finally getting to peek at some of the chats. And so I want to thank you for those suggestions, and thanks everyone for other suggestions and comments.
Well, if you have another minute, Debbie, we could talk for quite some time. I have several pages of notes to follow up on with you, so we do need to schedule a further conversation. But again, since Linda Urban is doing such a good job of making sustainability sexy, she gets bonus points and gets us an extra specific question, which is, do you work to make the different mental models explicit to students to begin to help develop the capacity to see them, and then, of course, to consider different ones? So that's from Linda.
Do I work to make the mental models explicit to students? Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by different ones, if you're able to? I don't know was it Linda that asked that question?
Yeah, Linda may still put something in the chat box, although she's still lolling, LOL, from my jokes about the sexiness of sustainability. So what I'd like to do then is, again, thank you, Debbie. And of course, Linda has supplemented by saying, if students can learn to see their own, it can help them to be open to others. So I think that's a good note to end on. And again, I thank you, Debbie, for really a fascinating presentation. And I can speak for all of us. We all learned a lot, and we look forward to reading your new book. Thanks again.
Oh, thank you so much.